This is my March 2025 essay called Villains. Everyone is a villain in someone's story. I think a lot of us have a villain among our childhood movement teachers. You know, that one teacher or coach that you love to hate, or maybe just hated. It is especially scary to think that you might be that coach for someone. But the reality is, you probably are. And that can make movement teaching feel especially fraught for a lot of us. Let me introduce you to one of my villains. I'm going to call him Shihan Carter. Shihan wasn't his first name. It's a title for master instructor in the discipline of American karate that I did when I was a kid. In retrospect, I think my dojo did a pretty good job with cultural humility. We learned about the history of our tradition, which was a mix of Okinawan Shoin-ryu and Isshin-ryu styles. We learned to count and say words in Japanese, and were generally taught that upholding the traditional heritage of our form was a good thing. Despite being in North Carolina, which was fairly segregated, the dojo was pretty integrated. Shihan Carter was black, and many of my instructors and fellow students were too. So what made Shihan Carter a villain in my story? Well, he was the kind of instructor who walked into a room and everyone just kind of tensed up. Everyone would hit harder, yell louder. He had a presence. He was weighty, dangerous, kind of judgmental. He was intimidating, uncompromising, militaristic. He gave praise really sparingly, so when he did, it was a big deal. You would ride one good for the rest of the class, sometimes like the rest of the week, and boy, did we all want to impress him. I was not a particularly athletic kid, so I did not impress him very often. I was quiet, inquisitive, a bit awkward. I'd sometimes ask questions that were honest but directed at questioning authority. I'd point out when my instructors got it wrong. I hated sports and competitions, and I wasn't super social at the school, but I loved martial arts. I was particularly good at katas, kind of martial arts choreography, but I hated sparring, the fighting part. This made me really unusual among the boys, and it was probably fairly clear that I was gay. When I was 13 or 14, I tested for my black belt. This was a 4-hour-long ordeal that culminated in a final test, breaking 3 cinder blocks. You had to break all 3, and you got 3 tries. With the whole school watching, I only broke 2 out of the 3 and failed my whole test. I didn't get sad or depressed, at least I don't remember being sad or depressed. I got obsessed. I went home and practiced for 3 weeks and came back later and went into Shihan's office and asked to break my blocks for him, just him. We went into the back room and I did it. Bam, bam, bam. No hesitation. And he said something that I'll never forget. It's not about passing the test. It's about who you are inside. I can see that you are a black belt now, and we will sort out the rest. He doesn't sound much like a villain, does he? 4 years later, I tested for my 2nd degree black belt. This test was a total fiasco. It was the middle of summer in North Carolina. It was over 100 degrees. There was no air conditioner, and the test lasted almost 6 hours. I was testing with 2 other people, one who was testing for my rank but did poorly and passed, and the other who was testing for a higher rank and got heat stroke and ended up at the hospital. The one who went to the hospital was a guy in his mid-20s, and he was testing for his 4th degree black belt. He had been one of the most talented students at the school. He was a bit of a golden child or star student and would win all the regional tournaments. After the test, a rumor went around that Shihan Carter had made the test particularly grueling on purpose because he felt that this student needed to be taken down a peg. I was collateral damage in what seemed like a vendetta. I almost made it through, though. I faltered in the last 10 minutes during sparring. The ambulance had already come and gone, and I had started to kind of see stars and feel dizzy, and I was in my 5th minute of fighting. Fight for 10 more seconds. Keep fighting, keep fighting. And instead, I gave up, dropped my hands, sat down. He didn't yell, he didn't scold me. He just ended the test and moved on to the next person. We didn't talk for weeks. When we did, he didn't apologize or offer words of encouragement. He just told me I'd have to repeat the test. I don't remember feeling sad or depressed. I remember feeling cheated. I remember feeling disillusioned for weeks, for months. It was maybe a year and a half later that I left the dojo and joined a smaller school that had been started by a senior instructor who watched Shihan Carter's power trips for years and wanted to do things a little differently. So what makes him a villain in my story? I failed a couple big tests. I didn't get any special treatment. In retrospect, was he really a villain, or was I kind of expecting some sort of special treatment, expecting things to go differently? To this day, it's one of the only times in my life that I have been held unsparingly to a failure. So let's be a little more precise with our language. A villain is someone who opposes the main character because of an abhorrent or evil set of values. Villains are evil, opposed to us by definition. An antagonist opposes a main character because of circumstance. Antagonists can be heroes on the other side if you look from a different perspective. So maybe Shion Carter isn't a villain. Maybe he's just an antagonist. That doesn't mean he was right. That doesn't mean he didn't love his power and exercise his authority just for the sake of it, demanding respect instead of earning respect. I still have dreams about him, and I still teach in contrast to him. My next martial arts teacher, let's call him Sensei Sharp, was equally demanding, but was kind. He saw martial arts as a vehicle for personal development, for developing people, an approach that I agree with and use in my own teaching. And yet, when you teach movement, especially to kids, but also to adults, you feel the responsibility of creating meaning. Some people react to this responsibility by shying away from high-stakes moments, from real challenges, out of fear that it will go badly, fear that a student will hate them, fear that they'll become the villain. But sometimes to create meaning, we have to risk being a villain. I've noticed myself being a villain for some of my students sometimes, not on purpose, not out of malice, but just because my hands are tied. I'm forced to uphold certain standards of practice, certain ways of being, certain traditions of teaching, sometimes for reasons that I don't even entirely understand. I've heard and said some of these same phrases that I hear from studio owners 1,000 times. This just happens when you're in charge. Someone has to be the bad guy. I don't make the rules, even if you do make the rules. There's more going on here than I can go into. I wonder how much of this is true and how much of it is a story we just tell ourselves to avoid discomfort. As a coach, have you ever felt like your hands were tied? As a studio owner, have you ever felt like your hands were tied? What exactly is tying your hands, and what would it take to untie them? I'm not saying that our actions exist outside of context. Sometimes our choices are constrained. But how often do we assume that constraint? How often do we default to old systems of decision-making or old systems of business or old systems of relations with our students because we can never pause to imagine another way? I am not interested in quick answers anymore. I am interested in wondering why power and villainy always seem to come together. Why does institutionalization and systemizing always seem to reduce humanity? I think there is a big puzzle here that we, as a species, haven't cracked yet. How do we create human systems? How do we create human institutions? How do we organize large groups with organization instead of hierarchy? Because hierarchy inevitably leads to power, inevitably seems to lead to villainy. How do we create something without the need for people to behave in unethical ways because they feel that their hands are tied?